All right. Well, we may go ahead and begin introductions, and I'm going to keep an eye on if we have anyone else show up, and I'll get them in here from the waiting room. Good evening, everyone. If you don't know me, I am Pastor Jessica Hanks. I'm at the First Baptist Church in Stillwell as Administration and Worship Pastor. You'll also see Pastor Franklin Ruff. He's with us this evening. He is our teaching pastor at First Baptist Church in Stillwell. This is an effort that we are making on a quarterly basis, just to try to bring about conversation among our churches, among ADC churches, ecumenically, just trying to bring up topics that are interesting for people and keep people in conversation and offer opportunities for growth. And so we're really excited to have you all here tonight. This evening with us, we have Dr. Pam Durso. She is the president of Central Seminary. We are so pleased to have her. I'm going to let her share with us in just a moment. We have Greg Henson with us. He's in my top right corner. Greg is the president at Sioux Falls Seminary. So we're glad to have him. And then we have Dr. Bill Scheel. He is the president of Northern Seminary. When we set out to do this, we did not think that we would recruit 3 seminary presidents to be with us, but we are so fortunate that they all agreed, and we are just so pleased to be able to offer this conversation. And we will post it later as well, so that others who are not able to join us tonight, recognizing it is Advent season, we are close to Christmas, there may be others who want to see this, give them the opportunity also to listen in. So thank you for being with us. I'm going to let Greg, would you like to begin introductions for us?
Can I jump in
yes.
right before we begin introductions? I'm going to have to take a little bit of liberty because the dean and president of my seminary and my New Testament professor is here, Dr. John Byron. Thank you for showing up. He was my New Testament professor back at Ashland Theological Seminary. He has since gotten out of the classroom and is now the dean and president of the seminary. So I just wanted to take the time to recognize him as well.
Thank you, Franklin. It's good to be here. I happened to see he had this on his Facebook page after reconnecting him last week for the first time in, what, 6 or 8 years? So I thought I'd take advantage of being a fly on the wall tonight. So thanks a lot.
Well, now you've been identified and called out, so you will have to share your wisdom with us as well. We are so happy to have you. Thank you for joining us. And because we are a small group, we are going to have the ability to interact a little bit more freely and to ask questions. So you can put questions in your chat. Franklin's going to monitor the chat for us, but as long as we're not talking over one another and we're taking turns, we can also just unmute and ask questions as well. I think we have some space for that as we don't have too many here this evening. Greg, would you like to start for us?
Sure. My name is Greg Henson, and I grew up in the church. My mom is an ordained American Baptist pastor, and that had a huge impact on my life because I never actually saw myself being a seminary president, just saw myself as being someone who cares deeply about the church and deeply about discipleship and participation in the kingdom. So through a random chain of events that took me to Northern Seminary, actually, and then now to Sioux Falls, the primary focus we have is really on a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about tonight is how does the church and the academy function as a system. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight. So that's a bit about me. Jessica could probably tell you all kinds of stories. She and I went to college together, but we'll skip that part. So back to you.
Dr. Durso, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Pam Durso. I am the president of Central Baptist Theological Seminary in Shawnee, Kansas. I have been here since June the 1st of this year, so I'm still the new president. I get to use that new word. And someday I'm going to do some research around people in ministry and leadership who have parents who are pastors. I think that's a big influence. My father was a Southern Baptist pastor, so growing up, church was my life. And we lived in the church building much of the time, it seemed like. And that influenced me. I think I started preaching to my Barbies long before they were ready to listen, and baptized them on a regular basis in the bathtub. So that influence of childhood church has been with me forever. I came to Central from Baptist Women in Ministry. I was executive director of a nonprofit that resourced and supported women called to ministry, serving in Baptist circles. So it's been a good learning curve here as a new president. I wasn't in the academy. For about 10 years, I did other things. So it's been an interesting season to relearn how to function with ATS and all of the accreditation and structures of a system. But I've got a great partnership here and so many leaders, and it's been good. It's really good.
Sorry, Dr. Shield, would you like to introduce as well?
Thanks so much, Jessica. Thank you, Jessica and Pastor Franklin as well for just for convening this meeting. And I don't rarely get the opportunity to talk to Dr. Durso and to President Henson very often. So this is a good excuse to get together and to meet some friends. And Byron, you can't sit on the sidelines of this conversation. Okay, you can't be a fly on the wall. You're doing great stuff at Ashland, so I'm excited to hear from you as well. I have been president at Northern Seminary for almost 5 years. It'll be 5 years in March. Prior to coming to Northern, I was a pastor of Cooperative Baptist, Southern Baptist churches, and had the opportunity to call many seminary graduates and live the life of a pastor of wishing that seminary train more ministers who are church ready. And so when Northern called, of course, most of you know that we're in Chicagoland, and it was a unique opportunity, sort of blending my own interests in seminary education as well as training pastors for the church and doing something creative about race and justice issues as well. And my wife and I have 2 boys. I have a college student and then an 8th grader who's walking through here quite a bit right now on his way to swim practice. But I'm looking forward to this particular conversation. The journey we've been on at Northern, not unlike the one under great leadership of Pam and Greg at Sioux Falls. Just we're all in the midst of those innovative times, and excited to hear new ideas tonight and then to learn what you're working on as well.
Thank you. We thank you all again for being here. So as Franklin and I were talking about having this conversation, we're interested, we know that the landscape is changing. It's changing significantly, and it's a little overwhelming for us as pastors. So you can just imagine what it feels like for those trying to train up pastors. There are a lot of new resources out there at your fingertips, new ways of doing things, but as many of us know, new ways of doing things brings challenges. And so we really wanted to open up the opportunity for conversation and to give the opportunity for these folks to share with us resources that we may not even know are available, and get to hear what their hopes are for the future, because it is also easy to get discouraged, as many of us know, and to feel totally overwhelmed. And so looking at what's available to us, we're excited about that opportunity. Pastor Franklin's going to start us off with a couple of questions as we begin, and then we're going to allow you all to ask your questions as well. So Pastor Franklin?
Okay, first question here is what trends do you see and what churches are looking for in leaders? What changes do you see, and what are the new needs that you see moving forward that may not have been needs in the past? And anyone can jump in and feel free to answer.
I think in our pre-conversation, as we talked about technology in the church and how that has become the theme of 2020, how do you use technology well? How do you build community when you cannot meet in person or when you have limitations around numbers? And I think that's something that we are all learning. One of the things I've discovered about Central is those are classes that have already been offered here. Virtual worship is part of our curriculum because we have virtual learning communities, and that's been part of Central Since 2016, we have offered a fully accredited Master of Divinity degree online. And so that was already part of the system and structure here. And so when the pandemic closed down churches to meeting in person, many of our graduates and students were already prepared. They knew the technology, they knew how to use Zoom because that's what they were using in their classes. They knew about video editing. They knew how to gather people and to help people to understand that you can still have connection even though you can't be together in person. And I think that's something, as we talked earlier before this conversation started, that's something that we're going to have to continue to learn, because I don't think this day of Zooming and virtual church is over. It's just the beginning of how do we do this in a new way that brings a model of gathering in person, but also reaching out to people who would never enter a church building and perhaps have no faith background, but are desperately in need of meaning in their life and want community. And I think this is an opportunity to kind of rethink how we do outreach and gather people in into our congregations. So I think it's exciting and scary and draining and exhausting and all of those things, but I see great potential for what we can do.
Greg, you want to jump in on that?
You're already unmuted, man. You go.
Okay. All right. You know, I totally agree with Pam, but I want to just kind of listening to the latest kind of customer surveys we've been doing and talking with churches. One of the interesting things that is coming back, though, is the soft skills of pastoral care, chaplaincy. Those are reemerging because of the rise of the anxiety and stress and mental illness in the congregation. There was a season there where everything was about the pastor as preacher and almost like public performer. But now we're seeing a greater demand for that, the one-on-one skills, as well as you know, what Brene Brown talks about is just simply being vulnerable again, and this ability to say to the congregation, I'm not exactly sure I know where we're going, but I'm going to be with you as we go there together. And that takes an incredible amount of humility and character and courage. So it's kind of funny, you know, the pastors I'm talking with, they'll say, you know, I've become the chief technology officer as well as the principal planner of the Zoom funeral. And so they have become a referee amongst the police, trying to tell the grieving family, the police have said you cannot have more than 50 in this room, while at the same time weeping with those who weep. So this amazing adaptability is happening that I think seminaries, by the way, are very good at teaching. The other thing that we're finding out too is I think we all know that the co-vocational, multi-vocational pastor minister is the wave of the future. But instead of thinking of that person as the other than and someone less than the full-time staff, churches are now seeking people who are intentionally multi-vocational to join with them and partner with them as full staff. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that as well.
That's a great segue, actually, Bill, to some of the stuff that I might have added. Then is, I think, Pam, you're spot on. I think technology is a huge thing. The number of people who are saying, I didn't know I was going to have to be a videographer, right? But well, I think the one of the words you used there was adaptability, Bill. The way we kind of talk about that is we see people asking for or trying to work with individuals who have what we call a developmental mindset. It's this recognition that I'm always going to be developing. I'm never done. I went to seminary or I was pastoring a church and then I went to seminary and now I'm done. Like, it's the developing or instilling in people that the learner agency really to continue the fact and to kind of take hold of their own discipleship journey and developmental journey is a big piece. That co-vocational stuff though, Bill, Chris Armstrong talks about it as this equipping ecclesiology, that shifting from professional clergy to this idea of coming alongside and walking with and being part of and equipping the saints, right? It's not the pastor has the religious goods and services that we then bestow upon people. And the part of the challenge is there's this tension between that's what we're seeing, but so much of the way that our church body and our academy and just what we experience in North America anyway has been so shaped and formed by the understanding of professional clergy that there's this weird kind of tension in between the two that I think all of us are trying to wrestle with. And I think that's the beauty of conversations like this, is I think all of us are trying to wrestle with this. It's not just an academy question. It's not just a church question. It's a body of Christ question. It's how do we as the body of Christ move forward together and recognize that we are one body. It's not that the academy serves the church or that the church serves the academy. That kind of dichotomy, what's happened over the years is people just look past it, right? The reality is a lot of churches just look past the academy. Like we're not going to use the academy at all. And honestly, as the academy, if we're honest with ourselves, we've done that a little bit too, right? Oh, fine. Well, the church doesn't know what it needs anyway, so we'll just tell them. And it's trying to move past that into this co-creational future where we're saying we got to do this in partnership. I think that's also true when you realize just the vast diversity of the answer to this question. The question that we're asking is so highly impacted by the denomination, the context, the way in which we imagine pastoral leadership in a given area. And we can't imagine that we have the answers. Like one program is going to fix it or one thing is going to fix it. It's how do we create a relational approach to theological education that recognizes this is something the body does, not something that we do or they do or whatever. But what are your thoughts, John? You don't get to sit on the side.
Excuse me. As I put in the chat thing, I mean, one thing that we're noticing that I think COVID has just accelerated is the needs for pastors or just church leaders in general to have an awareness and the ability to treat mental health challenges. We've seen for the last, decade particularly, but, younger generation seems to be dealing with higher instances of anxiety, things like that. COVID has just caused, anybody who hasn't had anxiety in the last 6 months is probably a liar. Sorry. But at Ashland, we have a significant counseling program for clinical purposes. But the challenge for us now is how do we transfer those same skills to those that are not going to be in a clinical setting, but still to recognize the signs of mental health and to treat it as mental health, but with the spiritual, with the spiritual side to it as well. Churches are wanting that too. The people they want their pastors to be preacher, teacher, bookkeeper, counselor. And
oh, go ahead, Bill. Bill, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think one of the things we're just framing up here in our coursework right now is, to use the example of Exodus, the leadership skills that Moses and Miriam had in the wilderness were totally different than the ones that they had in Egypt coming out of bondage. And we're moving in this sort of a wilderness mode where there's a whole new kind of leadership capacity that needs to be developed for pastors. So it's adaptability with a certain kind of skill set for this particular moment that we're in.
That's awesome, Bill, because you then get into the idea of, is it Numbers 11, where the 70 people are brought to the tent of meeting? It's where Moses is part of that adaptability and part of this equipping ecclesiology and some of what they want the pastor to be this, and this. The reality is no one can be this, and this. And that gets at one of the things, I hope this is okay, Franklin, to move to this, but Greg mentioned in the chat here that they're just so exhausted right now. Part of that is we have developed and been formed into a system that we pay somebody to do this, right? And how do we kind of embrace that tent of meeting moment in Numbers where the Spirit is then sent out with a 70. Now there were the 2 that kind of didn't do what they were supposed to, but even Moses says, I'm just so glad the Spirit was out on them, right? That's what I want everybody to do. And kind of leaning into that is going to require a deep level of partnership between the church and the academy, and just the recognizing that we cannot keep doing this thing that we're doing. Pam.
Well, I would be interested, Greg. I mean, you work with pastors and ministers every day, and you know how exhausted they are. What are some things that we could be doing as seminaries to provide the support that our alumni need and students are needing? Because most of our students they're not preparing for ministry, they're doing ministry. They are in ministry right now. So what are some of the things you think that we could be doing for them to support them?
One of the things that comes to mind is establishing those early habits of healthy rhythms. I remember when I was going to seminary that, you were working 2 jobs and you were going to school all day, and in some cases they had families. And so certainly we were not models of healthy living while we were going through seminary. And I think a lot of that has just continued on into when they become pastors and leaders in the church. And so I think there needs to be a kind of a shifting down a few gears, and maybe there needs to be a greater emphasis on that spiritual formation piece, that healthy rhythms piece. And I know that every seminary that I've ever looked at the curriculum for, they offer those courses, and some are more heavily emphasized than others. But boy, if and along with that, just having it's surprising to me how many pastors don't have mentors. That's been one of the key lifelines for the 25 years that I've been in ministry, is I've had for most of that time the same mentor who has talked me off the ledge a number of times and has given me encouragement and has kicked me in the rear end at times. And I think I honestly believe that if I didn't have that person walking with me through these years, that I'd probably be doing something else by now. And so really emphasizing the importance of that relationship, and not only encouraging the students to find a mentor, but how do we equip those who are going to walk beside those students as they begin those seasons of pastoral ministry or counseling ministry or whatever ministry they're in.
I think one of the things I have tried to do in these last 6 months is to be honest about my own anxieties and to be vulnerable with students and faculty and staff, that this is really hard. I moved from Georgia to Kansas in the middle of a pandemic. I sold a house and bought a house and used more Lysol than I've ever used in my whole life to try to stay safe in the midst of that. But just sharing the depth of anxiety that I, as the leader, am feeling, in order to free them to say, yes, this is hard for me too, and to step away from always feeling like you have to have all the answers, and that you have to have your act together, and that you have to be perfect, and that your videos have to be polished, and just the freedom to say, this is hard and I'm not going to be perfect at this, and I'm okay with that, and you need to be okay with that too. That's not a long-term answer, but that's my short-term answer of freeing students. And
a good word though, Pam. What we present as our institutional or church or personal persona has a huge impact on the way the conversations actually go. If we present something that's polished and not, and perfect all the time, it's hard to have vulnerable conversations because the expectation was that, and yeah, if we could have real life, real world, unedited conversations with people, man, that'd be a blessing for sure.
So where do you figure out the line as leaders of these academic institutions between being that vulnerable person and and being so vulnerable that people think, oh my gosh, that ship is going down. We need to look for a lifeboat here, because, you know, they're not leading, or they have no clue how we're gonna, you know, get out of this. So how do you find that spot, that in between place of demonstrating that vulnerability, but also still leading out of that?
I think that's a good question. And coming from the background from which I've come, where I've been a mentor to ministers and sat with them, sometimes I have a tendency to be overly vulnerable. And I've had to watch that, especially with staff. I do have to step up and be the leader sometimes, and not let my anxiety be right there in front. So I think that's a hard place for us to walk. But one of the things I've been vulnerable about is in these last few months, I have been in counseling. I found a therapist because I needed someone to process this anxiety. And I told that to one of my board members, and she said, oh, I won't tell anybody. And I was like, I think you need to tell everyone. We all need a therapist right now. We're all in need. And so I think sharing some of the healthy practices of self-care are something that we can be vulnerable about. I am working through this anxiety, and I have some places of safety and encouragement in my life, and you need that too. And if I can help you find those, that's been my offer to some who've been struggling. Therapy works, and it's a good thing for so many of us.
You know, I think one of the things, Greg, that Greg Henson and Pam Durso and I are all doing in our seminaries, and I assume John as well, is we've repositioned what we used to call supervised ministry and mentoring out of the classroom and into the context of the congregation. So there's a holistic understanding that the best way to bring Sabbath and mentoring and rest to the minister is to place that mentor in the context where the pastor is. So there's not a gap between crisis and conversation. And that has measurably changed the way pastors now are processing this particular pandemic, because one of the best places right now that we're actually finding pastors can be is in seminary, because at Central and Sioux Falls and Northern, you know, they've either got a cohort or they've got a minister in a faculty mentor with them. And in many times, we're now having one-off Zoom gatherings with students on particular issues. Jessica mentioned the micro courses. You know, we're all able to pivot quickly into problem solving, which seminaries have never really been known for that. Up until about 10 years ago, when we finally figured out, you know, the reason people come to seminary is because they actually want to learn how to pastor a church. You know, so we've taken the best of the theological background and biblical backgrounds, and now we're pivoting, and that really provides the kind of resilience. You know, I don't think we'll ever get into the mode of we're going to teach you how to build a car. You know, we can never treat a church like some kind of aircraft carrier that, you know, here's the guide and just put it together. But I do think there's a side that resilience comes not only from courageous conversations, but equipping in the moment. And I feel like, at least in our institutions that are on this call, that's the commitment we have. We're not going to let our students walk alone. We're not going to let our alumni just, you know, flounder out there. You know, the faculty are going to stay in touch with people. And that's a new thing that is really promising and hopeful for the future.
I would say that, you know, that vulnerability that I've had to allow the faculty and staff to hear, and I've been in this institution for 18 years. I basically grew up in Ashland professionally. I came here as a newly minted PhD and never thought I'd be in this role. So, you know, some of my colleagues who are my senior colleagues are now, you know, now they're working with me. But, you know, what I've had to do is just to say, yeah, I've got the same anxiety, that there's that same level of grief over the loss that we're all experiencing. But this is the direction that we know we need to go. We know that. And so, you know, we're not selling ourselves on a delusion. We know it's hard, but we're still able to bring ourselves together by going, yeah, we're going through this together, but we can acknowledge how hard it is. I mean, we're making changes. I know everybody is, and it's causing people to, I mean, I think to freak out sometimes. I mean, I've seen it in meetings. They're just like, they're coming unglued. And, you know, you just have to say, yeah, I acknowledge it. Just simply acknowledge that there's a great deal of loss that's going on. You know, I discovered a book. I was late to discover it, and you probably all know it already, but Todd Balsinger's Canoeing the Mountains. I finally ran across that book last Christmas, read it for the first time, and then read it a second time in April after we started encountering this. But actually, you know, maybe even a little earlier than that. But that's been helpful to me, just, you know, adapting Todd's approach to things of just letting everybody know you don't have all the answers. We're going on this together, and every day is a new adventure. You know, not being the person with all the answers is not the leadership model anymore. And it's one that we should not be communicating to our students, you know, telling, you know, putting up, you know, the idea that you're going to be the chief person that knows all the answers in your church. I think that's a very helpful model for our students to understand and to embrace.
Well, we got a pretty good question here in the chat. We've talked about what seminaries could possibly do for students and churches, but what do seminaries need from the local church? How can the local church assist the seminaries in doing what the seminaries are called to do?
I might jump in on this one. Greg and I have had conversations, so I think I'm okay saying this. I might not use the word need, but it's this idea of back to this partnership, right? What we need, I think, is to recognize that we can't do this apart from each other. The future is not the church figuring out how to develop leaders and the academy figuring out how to develop leaders. The future is saying we cannot imagine that there's a separation between the two. So what we've heard for so many years in the academy and the church is we gotta build a bridge back between the academy and the church. They've become so disconnected that we gotta build a bridge back to two. And I kind of want to get rid of the bridge language. So we gotta, like, in a perfect world, seminaries don't exist, right? Seminaries are just one part of developing disciples or leaders for the church. But that's really what the church is called to do. So how do we recognize that what we need is just a commitment? And I would suggest it's as much from the seminaries as it is from the church. But it's a commitment to saying the way forward is together. The way forward is to say, you know, if we as a seminary are developing programs and we don't have the church involved in the conversations about developing the programs, I think we're dead on arrival. If the church is developing leadership programs without the academy as part of the conversation, I think it's dead on arrival as well. But it takes an immense, this is John's point, it takes an immense level of humility from everybody to kind of put our pride, our identities in some case at the foot of the cross and say, you know, this is the work of the Spirit. How do we do this together? So that sounds a little bit like a broken record. I know I've said that, but that's what I would say the need is to recognize there is value in the two together. That either one by themselves is missing something important. That would be that. And then the other one is the kind of the tap on the shoulder piece, that we need the body of Christ to be tapping people on the shoulder and saying, hey, there's something in you that you might want to dive deeper on or be developed in. So that kind of ongoing leadership identification piece is a big deal. Bill, I saw you unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to let Pam jump in on that, and if you wanted to say something, Pam. Okay. Yeah, I agree totally with Greg on all of those things. Right now, Greg, with two G's, I'm bucketing churches in the pandemic in three categories. One is they are, I would just call them waiting for the pandemic to end so that they can conclude their ministry. And the second is stuck, waiting for the pandemic to end so that then they can figure out what their new ministry is going to be. And then the third group is the group that is already innovating. And it's a very small group, but they're already making the adaptive changes that need to be made. So depending on what bucket you're in, is they need, we need something different from each one of those kinds of congregations. And I'm sure there are more categories than that. But I do think churches kind of re-owning the leadership development role of discipleship, as Greg alluded to. But I think the second thing that we really need to have a healthy conversation about is how can congregations own the indebtedness equation of pastors. That is an area that time and again has been proven for every professional vocation. We have longer serving ministers, longer serving lawyers, longer serving physicians, you name it, every professional kind of vocation out there that requires any level of indebtedness. If we can lower that debt of that person, and the seminary's own part of this, the congregation's own part of this, we can actually create longer serving ministers, higher caliber ministers, better ministers. So that's a very practical thing if you're in a healthy position to have that conversation. If you're thinking you're about to sunset your ministry, I'm not sure you're ready to have that. If you're stuck, you might be open to it. But as those who are innovating now, I think recognizing that there is a financial piece that's going to be front and center, even more so coming out of this, that I think we could really talk about. The other thing I think we need from churches and Northern, one of our roles in the pandemic has been to convene and host conversations about difficult issues in our culture. And the seminary has kind of taken on the role that it used to have of having conferences. Now we do it over Zoom, but now we're having conversations about race and justice and gender and identity and you name it. And I think one of the things that we need from congregations is the ability to have those courageous conversations again. I'm fascinated based on what I'm seeing in the political landscape and watching the exit polls out of the election, is because most of the people who attend our congregations are still largely a part of the what we would broadly call white evangelicals, that they are largely insulated from the needs of urban America, from persons of color. And, Parker Palmer wrote a pretty good book about this. Churches and public schools are one of the last places where people can actually come together across racial and demographic lines. But we've forgotten that witness. And seminaries should not be the only places hosting those conversations. And I think we need to find a way, and I think Pastor Jessica and Pastor Franklin are using this forum as a way to do that. But I think it's time for the church to reclaim that important role of convener of those courageous conversations.
I will say, as someone who has come to American Baptist churches as a new person in this circle, and come to Kansas as someone who has no connection with most of the churches around, this has been a true learning experience of how to relate to churches when my only connection has been through virtual worship. How to meet pastors when I only meet them sometimes on Zoom or on the phone. It's been interesting to see how churches respond to new people in their community. And I have some buckets too, Bill, but I won't describe them. But I've watched as some churches have been so welcoming in the midst of this pandemic, and then some have been so, they do what they do and they have no space or capacity really to reach out and include new people who are visiting, even on Zoom or YouTube or in all those ways. And so I think that that conversation about how churches can, in this season that is hard, continue to be welcoming spaces and to not forget how to do that, that usually churches do so well. But it's just harder these days to acknowledge visitors, to welcome visitors, to invite people into your congregations. And how can we as seminaries help have that kind of conversation? There has been one church that I have visited more often than others, and it's not anywhere near where I would ever join a church because I'd have to drive for 3 hours on a Sunday morning one way. But they have been welcoming in ways that have surprised me and included me in conversations, and made me feel a part even in this time when they've never seen my face in person. And I'm wondering about how do we help churches, and how can churches help us in this season of learning to be welcoming in new ways of people who are new to the community. And I haven't had this experience in a very long time of being the new person on the block, of trying to get to know a church and churches in my neighborhood and my area. So I think it's a different season, and it's going to teach us something about the ways in which we do outreach and evangelism in the future, because I'm not so sure that we're all going to attend churches and be members of churches that are close to us. I mean, we're going to have members who are scattered throughout the state, or maybe the United States, or maybe around the world. And so how do we welcome those kinds of people? And I think that I need that from the church, is helping me to understand what this is going to look like, what membership in the church is going to look like in the next 5 years, that we figure that out together.
Well, let's jump to another academic question. For years, the trademark degree was the MDiv. And as the church is changing, as we are moving, I would say, back to a model of some churches, many churches having bivocational pastors, as there is a financial aspect to it. Are we finding that view of the MDiv as that primary degree is changing? If so, how, and what are some of the other tools that seminaries are providing, not only for pastors, but for churches to train lay leaders as well, and those bivocational pastors?
Because I'm a nerd, or because I don't have anything better to do, I've probably studied ATS data on this topic more than any one person should over the past maybe 15 years. And it is true, right? The MDiv enrollment of seminaries across North America for the past 20 years has steadily declined in the Master of Divinity. And what has changed is there are more students enrolling in Master of Arts degrees. What's been interesting, I think, is as I've tried to dive deeper into some of those conversations and found even some seminaries in ATS that have done market research on some of this, what I think is actually kind of at the root of this is not the idea of a Master of Divinity or the title of the Master of Divinity or ordination or any of that. It's that people don't want to pay $50,000 for a degree that takes 5 years, that's going to put them in debt and has no relevance to their context. If you can address those issues, it's not the title of the degree that's the problem. Is it going to be affordable? Is it going to take 5 years to complete? Is it going to be accessible from my location? And it turns out, I think, and there are some schools where this is true, that if you can address those three things, the MDiv is not the problem. The MDiv is not the problem. The problem is making things that are accessible, affordable, and relevant, and still being faithful to what it is God is calling us to do. So at Sioux Falls, we've not seen a decline in the Master of Divinity. It has, if anything, I think it's more than doubled in size over the past few years here. But I mean, so has every degree at our seminary. So that's probably not a good test case. But There are other schools I know where they are actually seeing increases in the Master of Divinity as well, but usually it's because they're dealing with one of those three things: affordability, accessibility, and relevance. That being said, in its traditional form, the Master of Divinity doesn't tend to allow for the kind of contextualized specialization that some of us have been talking about tonight, where it tends to be this jack of all trades degree, but it tends to be that way because that's the way that we have construed it over the past number of years. There's no law anywhere that says it has to be that. So that's where you can deal with the affordability issue, and some of the student debt stuff that Bill was talking about, and some great work has been done by some seminaries over the past number of years on that topic, like really good work. So there's good things happening with affordability. There's good things happening with accessibility, although I could have all the conversations about that one. But the relevance piece, unless we are willing to adjust what we define as the Master of Divinity, like the actual workings of that, I think we're still going to see it as something that's not seen as relevant. So I'm not trying to make a case for, oh, the Master of Divinity is the gold standard and we've got to, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that what we're seeing is not that it's the problem. It's affordability, accessibility, and relevance that's the problem. And one of the ways we know that is it's because of the perception. If you look at the ATS data over the past 20 years, it takes about 4.5, 4.7 years on average for somebody to finish a Master of Divinity. It takes about 4.2 years for someone to finish a Master of Arts degree. So in reality, if someone's going to graduate from a seminary in North America, it's going to take about 4 years, regardless of what degree they take. But because of the perception of the Master of Arts being more accessible, more affordable, more specialized, people are choosing it. But in reality, it's not actually saving them a lot of time or money to do that degree. So I think it's more about perception than it is about reality, but obviously reality is somebody's perception. So I think it's a good question to ask. I think we as seminaries have to realize that what we've been doing with a Master of Divinity is not serving the church well. We have to own that. It has not been good. But it's not that we have to throw it out and start from scratch. We have to start back with the church and say, how do we do this together, and some of that. But the other thing that I think has been interesting about the lay ministry piece with the Master of Divinity, it is, so about 60% of the students enrolled in our system don't plan to participate in congregational ministry. So they are leadership. So they are in congregations, or but they're not planning on being lead pastors of any sort, or of that. We've had fighter pilots, doctors, real estate agents, that kind of stuff as well. They choose the Master of Divinity because it's going to give them this exposure to the Christian tradition that they can then integrate with their work. So it's this integration of faith and work. So I think there's value in the program for lay people. I think there's value in the program for people who plan on being pastoral leadership, but only if the seminaries are willing to lay down their control and not mandate every step that has to be taken along the path to creating a degree, whether that's a Master of Arts degree or a Master of Divinity degree. We have to allow that path the student takes to be contextualized and kind of sourced from the context rather than handed down or imposed upon them. And I think if we do that, at least what we're seeing right now in the data is where that's happening, the MDiv's actually doing fine. So I think all I'm saying is maybe it's not the degree that's the problem. Maybe it's how we're doing the degree. Does that make any sense? I mean, some other people besides me have studied the data, so but that's kind of what I've seen, Franklin.
So how at Sioux Falls have you responded to accessibility and affordability and relevance in your Master of Divinity planning?
So the way we've responded to it was we put all of our programs on a subscription price and got rid of student debt as much as possible. So we've decreased it by about 96% over the past 6 years. but the accessibility is by leveraging both online but in person, bringing together some of the embodied realities of education, connecting it with online. So that's where some of the mentoring stuff that Greg has talked about, and I think Bill, you referenced. But the relevance piece is by defining the outcome, but allowing the student in the context to define the pathway. So that's a big, I think the MDiv has become a problem in the church, not because of the program, but because of the educational philosophy that imbues the program. And so that the program is imbued with, I should say. And so how do we shift the philosophy to say that quality is determined in output and impact, not path? And we as the academy are so caught up in the path is where the path is where we determine quality, which means we have kind of inconsistency in outcome and impact. So if we could switch that, I think you get at the relevance piece. I think you can get at the affordability piece. John, you were going to say something too.
I was just going to say is that, you know, for Ashland too, our MDiv is still actually our biggest degree. But, you know, when we talk about bivocational, it's interesting though that every year, the biggest percentage, the growing percentage is actually those that are in our MDiv chaplaincy. I think this year, 40% of our MDiv students are going into a chaplaincy track. And I think that gets to what you're talking about, Franklin, with the bivocational aspect. An MDiv that does something like chaplaincy, and it doesn't have to be chaplaincy, but it really does communicate to the student the ability to have ministry within the church, but recognizing they're going to have a vocation also someplace outside, but allows them both to work together. And I think that's what makes it attractive, and it makes it work for them. You know, that they're able to do the same thing, if you will, 7 days a week, even though it may be in different context every day. So.
And one of the things that attracted me to Central is something that I have worked on throughout my ministry career, is kind of expanding the understanding of what ministry is. It's not always within the walls of the church. And so a good majority of our students at Central are also working toward chaplaincy. We have a new master's degree in counseling that began earlier this year, which if the timing of that is not, I would say providential, even though I'm not of that persuasion always, but it's providing students with ways to see ministry opportunities outside of some of the traditional understandings has been a valued part of my ministry experience, especially because I've worked with women, and women often don't have opportunities to serve in roles in the church, especially as senior pastors. Helping women to understand that God has gifted them and called them, and they can, wherever they are called to serve and use their gifts, is their ministry. And so we have a lot of nonprofit leaders who end up here at Central. Either they've already started a nonprofit or they do that while they're in school. We have some who are teachers who are seeing that as an opportunity to deepen their faith experience and use that in their vocational calling. So I think that's one of the places, as we talk about church has, to me, has been more generously defined in the last season of my life. That church happens for us sometimes outside of a building and outside of the walls. And I think 2020 has certainly helped us to expand the understanding that, you know, church can be beyond just what we sometimes think of it. So ministry happens in all the places to which God calls. And I see that in our students, a good number of our students, interestingly, come to Central because of some of our certificate programs that are not MDiv based. We have 70% of our students are Asian. We have a Korean language program that is quite large. We have students from Myanmar who are have a long connection with that group of people, and they are our new Doctor of Ministry program that begins in the spring. We have 7 students from Myanmar, some living here in the States, some back in their country, who will learn together. So forming ways that people can be educated, perhaps not in an MDiv program, but in certificate programs around the world has been an important part of Central's journey. And I was talking to our provost today at lunch, asking him some questions about the enrollment of, especially in our Korean language program. We have a good number of students who come to that program, not as Christians, but as people who've been introduced to Christianity and want to know more about it. So they come from a Buddhist background sometimes, and they are interested in faith, but they want to know more than they're learning in their churches. So they enroll in Central really to learn the foundational principles and practices of the Christian faith. And in that regard, Central helps to provide the learning that they need to take that step toward the Christian faith, which is a really interesting place to be as a seminary. I think I had, that's certainly not my experience as a seminary student, but because of our certificate programs and diploma programs, we have some of those who come to faith as a result of coming to seminary, which is wonderfully lovely, I think.
Well, we have a few more questions, but I'd also invite questions from anyone who wants to put a question in the chat, or we're small enough, you can just take your microphone off and go ahead and ask your question. We can do that as well. And if not,
I have a question for people like Aaron and Jennifer here. Forgive me for blocking Greg out. I've just talked with Greg enough, but over the years. But when you hear the word affordable or accessible or relevant or things like that, what do those words mean to you? Like what does affordability mean? One of the things that I try so hard to have conversations about is words carry definitions with them. And so that definition comes from whatever community is saying the word is going to define that word. And I would love to hear so maybe Aaron, if you wouldn't mind going first, when you hear those words, affordable, accessible, relevant, things like that, what are you thinking? What are you imagining?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is access.
Okay.
When I hear affordability and the other items that you mentioned, it makes it accessible where you can pursue something academically and have some type of specialization in the field of ministry.
So when you think of affordable, I'm going to just keep asking you here, what number comes to mind? Like, oh yeah, this is an affordable, this would be, $25 a month is affordable, or $100 million a month is affordable. What, for a church, for the kind of people you talk with, when you're talking about access, what does where I'm going or where I'm at, where some of this is coming from is we as seminaries tend to talk about affordable in terms of tuition price. And we're like, if we can raise a bunch of money in scholarships, we can make tuition more affordable. And I want to be like, that doesn't actually make it a lot more affordable because somebody's paying that somewhere, right? So that we're not actually lowering the cost necessarily. We're just shifting the cost someplace else. So, but what does affordable look like in your context or some of the people that you talk with?
Well, affordable to me would be, again, going back to access. If you have a family, if you're working, if you have a mortgage and you're paying bills and you're raising children and that type of thing, if it's affordable, then it becomes more doable for more people. And, certainly, again, you can gain something affordable becomes more accessible to the goals that you're trying to pursue. Those are some of the thoughts that come to my mind when you say affordability.
Great. How about you, Jennifer? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I hope it's okay.
Oh, sure, that's fine. I'm region staff. I'm the associate executive minister for the Central region. So I'm the person who's trying to figure out how to get young people to go to seminary. I'm that tap on the shoulder person who's trying to figure out these kids I work with, how do I get them to want to go to seminary? And to me, affordable means when I'm done, can I afford to keep living and pay my student loans, right? And if I'm a bivocational pastor, or if I want to do something, but I feel called to ministry, so I might do an undergraduate degree in education and then still do youth ministry as a part-time ministry position. The idea of going to seminary is unaffordable, right? Because, if I go to 4 years of school, I'm teaching, and then I have to go another 4+ years to seminary, I probably won't be able to do it. So affordable for me means I can, when I have the job, I can pay the bills. And so I think it depends on what you're going to do about whether it's affordable or not, right? And I have a real, when you guys talk about all these people that you have going to seminary who are called to other kinds of ministries, whether that's nonprofit or counseling or chaplaincy, as an area executive, I worry about, well, what about all those people that want to be pastors? These churches I have where the pastors are gray and are retiring, and we're going to need new pastors. And how do we find those, and how do we partner with you to do that? So I think that's my biggest concern. And so for it to be relevant means that you're going to teach me to do the ministry that I want to do, whether that's youth ministry or pastoral ministry. I mean, we have pastors that work 3 jobs to be able to be pastor. I mean, I have the greatest respect for these people who have, given everything to be able to do this. They mow lawns or teach piano or whatever they need to do to keep a job. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, that's helpful.
But,
that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead.
No,
yeah,
go ahead,
I was
Bill.
going to say we maybe we're the outlier in the equation, because we're still about 76-80% of students headed toward pastoral leadership in a congregational setting. So, but what we found in answer to your question is, you're exactly right that the average church is struggling to find a seminary trained pastor and to make it accessible and affordable. And the other thing we found in our customer research is so many congregations, especially in Baptist life, are, will more likely tap on the shoulder of the person who's willing to get up and speak, who listens to Christian radio and knows a sermon, to be the in-house preacher than they are to say, hey, we want to get you trained up to deliver a theologically sound sermon. So what we've had to do is redesign the process where we have a good, better, best model. So we have classic live stream accessible education, but recognize that a lot of our prospective students are probably going to get started at a subscription level. So, in our case, we launched a masterclass style platform called Seminary Now, where we have congregations who are just using this to give people the basics, but it's an entry point, like the way masterclass is for the hobbyists. Well, this is, if you've never been to seminary before, you don't have a college degree, but you've been tasked, you've been anointed and appointed to be the preacher, you need at least something, right? And then an in-between step for that, of course, would be something on the level of more continuing ed classes, where you're going by Zoom, you're taking a course or two, you're getting what in the old days we called the certificate of ministry, 5 classes, Old Testament, New Testament, some kind of audit, and then you're into a graduate level program. So what we're trying to do is, in some ways, like John the Baptist did for Jesus, we want to prepare the way for seminary as much as we're honing the way we deliver seminary education. Just recognizing that the congregational crisis is the reason there's a leadership vacuum is not just because we've had a struggle with discipling people, but we have some congregations who have just struggled, right? And so let's just admit this is where they are. and let's find some easier on-ramps that are more direct to consumer. I mean, we pay close attention to what Amazon's doing to us, right? So how do we get that to your doorstep? How do we get that into your living room on your schedule? And I would say, Pam, Greg, all of these schools are thinking about this. If they're doing their job, they're thinking about this, because that's, to me, that's that holistic mission that we have that goes back, I mean, as far as Ignatius of Loyola. The seminary was the training institute. It was the frontline mission outpost. The Jesuits sent seminaries in first into the unreached places to train up priests, so that when they started churches, there'd be trained clergy. So I think we're kind of reclaiming our mission, if you will, of training, whether ATS approves it or not. Can I say that on this Zoom call? Okay.
No, it's recorded. Yeah, it's recorded.
All right. Okay, it's being recorded. All right, just don't post it. But really, I mean, we're recognizing we all have a broader mission beyond a 10-year accreditation cycle. It's going to be one part of it, right? But there's going to be a broader piece.
And that's a huge part of accessibility. Is
Right.
we tend to think of accessibility in terms of location, but accessibility has so much more to do with the right level at the right time, and has a lot to do with how time works. Like if we just put stuff online, but still it's boxed in a week, it's not actually, in terms of time, that accessible. So time is a big deal, location is a big deal, but level is a huge deal. That's good. Pam, I saw you unmute yourself there.
Yes. So Jennifer, I would say to you, so not based on my experience here at Central, but I served as an adjunct professor at McAfee School of Theology, that's part of Mercer University in Atlanta, for about 10 years. And what I saw in teaching students who came through McAfee is they would come into seminary saying, I've been burned by the church. I don't want to have anything to do with the church, but I love Jesus and I want to serve. And so they had ideas about, nonprofit and chaplaincy and other ways to serve. But as I would watch them come through the seminary experience, we need them begin to fall in love with the church again and realize that God is at work in the church. And so some of that, I think, is the openness of professors to help students understand the importance of the church, and that the church is at the center of how we serve in the world. And I haven't seen that at Central. I haven't been here long enough to see that experience, but I've seen it in other seminary settings where part of the seminary experience opens the hearts of students to serve in the church when that was not their intent at the beginning stage. And so I think you have to have professors willing to do that work too.
I mean, I know a couple of people who are, one's starting at Central this winter, one is just started at Sioux Falls that I'm mentoring, and I know they're still kind of discovering, what God's calling them to do. And I understand that. I mean, I didn't go to seminary having all the answers either. So, but I do think that, we have a real need in our churches for good pastors who have theological education, who have gained skills, and they have, I want pastors that love Jesus and feel called to ministry, but I want them to also have the skills that it takes. It's putting them in a place where they're not prepared to do ministry.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the denominations we work with, because it being in South Dakota, rural ministry is a big deal, right? So you have the church that's in a town of 250 people. Surprise, surprise, it's really hard to get somebody to move from Chicago to be a pastor at one of those. And so we have denominations that, this denomination's not alone in this. Others deal with that in other places besides South Dakota. But one of the things they have found some success in is thinking about how we help people grow where God planted them. So how do we help the church identify people within the church to become those pastors of that church, rather than trying to find somebody else and bringing them there? And that's where the tap on the shoulder, where the church working with the seminary together, because I know Bill and you guys have done a good job with this, of refocusing around, we train pastors. But unless something has changed since the last time you talked, a lot of those people are currently serving too. Like they are involved in pastoral ministry before they start seminary, right? And I think that is the norm for the for all of ATS. We have so many schools. The handful where that's not true tend to be the Dukes, the Emory's, some of those places, Denver a little bit. But even in those places, the majority of our people are people who are somehow engaged in ministry already. And that's where I think, come back to one of the questions early on, is what do we need from the church? It's that, how do we help people see that they can grow where God planted them? And there's something there. I don't know. I don't have an answer to it, but I've seen it work in a few denominations where they didn't come looking for somebody. It turns out if you can get a person who's a farmer and working at a church, farmer going to church, but then sees leadership capacity because they've been tapped on the shoulder. Well, it turns out Central, Ashland, Sioux Falls, Northern, others, there are all kinds of ways we can work together with that person. Whereas getting a person to go there is a whole lot harder than it was even 10 years ago. The contextuality of the human experience has been so random. It's this weird, like, we've never been more global as a society, but I would suggest we've also never been more local as a society. And we've got both going on at the same time.
And I would be remiss if I did not say that there are women who are willing to uproot and move anywhere to serve God and to pastor. And I think as we work with churches and help them to reimagine what pastoral leadership looks like, I think there are enough available ministers, but many of them are women. Mm-hmm. Churches are hesitant to call them.
Amen. Amen.
Yeah, and I think one of the things to pick up on that, Pam, that we have found in our placement of women, as well as in congregations that are solo pastor, is where there is success in either a new face coming in, man or woman, but especially with women, is the denomination or the network is able to provide a 2-year residency before leadership is announced, so that there is a enculturation period, and where the person becomes comfortable with the congregation finds a fit, and there's not, in the old days, you get called to a church and your first day in the pulpit is the first day you're the pastor, and you're the first, you have all of this culture shock. But what we found, especially with the solo pastors, and then with churches that are trying to raise up next gen leadership, is the denomination can actually step in. Indiana's doing some of this. Nebraska's attempting this some, is to provide a residency kind of funding where there's a 2-year, there's something magic about 2 years, right? 3 years seems too long. 1 year is not quite long enough, but we all kind of know that, there's going to be a handoff to Lydia, or there's going to be a handoff to Elisha, but right now we're just here to get to know each other. And that seems to be a very helpful thing that denominations could be really creative about right now in helping bridge that.
Yeah, that's good. How do you see some of that work in Greg Hammond?
It's a great question. I'm thinking of a number of our churches in the central region that, at least for the women in leadership situation, that we would love to, and we've even got some women that are gifted and capable, but making that theological bridge for them is a hard sell. I don't know.
We just had a very successful transition of a woman who was campus pastor at a Vineyard church to one of the largest mega churches in the evangelical Christian network here. And we consulted with her and the lead pastor, and she's now the lead pastor of one of their largest sites. But she had been preaching publicly for about 2 or 3 years, both in their denominational network on national stages as well as at that campus. So she was not a stranger to them on Sunday one. And we're learning from them, but then also we've been able to walk with them, and we're seeing this quite a bit across the Midwest. So just something to file away.
Well,
Mom's doctor of ministry that she did at Northern was actually on that kind of transitional period, and that's a lot of what she saw on her thing was if there's an intentionality like that mantle passing. The challenge that she found was whether or not churches, particularly the person who's leading the church at the time, is willing to invest in that mantle passing.
Yeah.
But it's a big deal. Sorry, Jennifer, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, as as a woman in ministry, I have discovered that the best way to support upcoming women in ministry is to be the best pastor you can be. And so, whenever given the opportunity to be that person, that's the best message, I think, for our churches. And so, if we can get pulpit supply in front of churches, if we can get women, to do anything in a church, service as an interim, then it's the best opportunity we have, I think, for that. And I think that sometimes women are other women's worst enemies, because there's this feeling of, there aren't very many of those senior pastor jobs. And so there's this kind of ego jealousy thing that happens when we see someone else who has that. And whether we intend to or not, we tend to undermine the leader. The women tend to undermine other women leaders. So
I think I've seen change happen in churches so many times when it's a daughter of the church who is called, and suddenly it isn't a scary woman pastor. It's someone they love dearly, who is gifted and who they've nurtured her faith, and suddenly God is calling her to ministry. And when it becomes a personal face, it's no longer frightening. And so that's, I think churches, as we seek to nurture children and provide models of ministry for them, churches will begin to change their attitudes as they see daughters in their churches called and serving.
Well, and do you think that's not just true for women, but it's all, it's also the whole idea of diversity, right? I mean, the fact that Franklin is called to a almost all white church in suburban Kansas City, if you had told me that was going to happen 10 years ago, I would have said, yeah, right, sure. So, I think that diversity is something else that we are really called to do, is to try to see the potential in people and not limit their ministry to someone who looks like them.
Yeah. And that's
the only thing I would add, Jennifer, is I have a different view of what suburban is. I don't know that I would call this suburban, but I would agree on everything else.
I think that ties into, oh, go ahead, Pam. Sorry, go ahead, Pam.
I was going to say, you may be following up on that. I had something.
No, go ahead.
To choose. With 70% of our students being Asian, helping churches to see pastors who don't look like them, who have a different cultural experience, and that's a hard place to be as well. How can we convince white Baptist churches in Kansas and Missouri and Oklahoma and Arkansas to think about a Korean pastor who is gifted and called and has more energy and will pray with you at 6 a.m. every single day?
Mm-hmm. I think that gets actually kind of back to earlier questions, and I think Bill put this in this idea of something that we could need from the church is this convening of courageous conversations. Like part of what we're getting at, and you touched on this a little bit, Greg Emmett, is the theological shift that some churches need to make to do any of the kind of things that we're talking about here. We in Sioux Falls, we have students in 30 different countries now, I think, and 4 different languages and 70 different denominations.
Wow.
And what's beautiful in that is it invites students to experience what theological hospitality looks like. It's to recognize, like, I can have conviction in my theological understanding, but this person over here loves Jesus too. And they can have, and so finding a way to have those conversations. But what we're finding is where that becomes difficult, or where that tends to break down, is where in some place or another, that person's not encouraged to have those same conversations outside of the seminary. So if their only place of having those courageous conversations is in a classroom, we wrestle with this. It becomes difficult. It becomes difficult for people. So if we can have the church be a place to have conversations like that, if we can have the seminary to be a place like that, if we can have pastoral gatherings of people that are having conversations like that, if we can have conferences that are having, basically, if we can help the church learn how to have conversations with itself in healthy ways, there's some good impact, I think, that could come from that. To have the willing to have the courage to have some of those conversations. But that's a challenge, right? So my mom, right, served as an area minister as well. And it's hard to be able to steward some of those. It's not an easy thing to do.
Well, I think at this point, we are to the point where we will need to be wrapping up. So I'm going to ask for all of you to, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessica, and then I'll ask for you all to give some final comments on what you think about this partnership between academia and the church, and we'll have some closing announcements, and I'll go home to the kids.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just going to invite you. We're down to staff and us, really. So just what closing comments or what ways we can partner together. I want to just say personally, I'm grateful for the micro courses and conversations. I'm trying to engage in those as you all are putting those out there. So thank you for that. And I'm trying to encourage people that I'm in contact with to participate in those as well. I hope that those continue. So hear that, that piece. But what other closing comments that you all want to share with us?
Well, what I am learning as a new president in the midst of a pandemic is that this is really a great time for reimagining everything. We are having conversations about where Central is going, our vision, our property, and I think having those conversations in churches as well. How can we partner together and just reimagining what our partnership together looks like, what church looks like? I think this is a season where changes happen to us, whether we wanted it or not, and change is going to continue to happen. So it's a good time for a conversation, and people seem to be more open to thinking about new ideas and creativity and being adaptive and in the midst of all this. So I think this is a weirdly exciting time to be a partner between churches and the academy.
Bill?
Yeah, I totally agree with Pam. One thing we haven't touched on that keeps burning inside of me is I think we as institutions and congregations need to think carefully about the way we steward our networks and our ecosystems for each other. In the old days, the seminary was the vendor for sending the pastor to the church or to the denomination. And that was the job that needed to be done, to borrow Clayton Christensen's language. But I think now we're long past that sense of you are hiring us to send you a pastor, but I can tell you that's still the number one request we get from denominational leaders is we need you to send us more people who can move out here. And so we need to think carefully about the importance of what role we do play in the clearinghouse. How do we network better our own congregations with each other and our leaders? And to Pam's point earlier about women in leadership and persons of color who are seeking places of ministry, the marginalized, what we would typically have called the left out from 10 years ago now becomes the focus of some of the most creative work that's going on. But I'm not sure we've leaned into that well enough as institutions. And so that's something that I'm giving close attention to myself, and something that I'd love to have some help with, about how we better lean into that, and how we can help each other.
The help each other stuff is, like at its core, theological education is a journey of discipleship. And I think where we may have gone a little, like took a tangent, or took a wrong turn, is when we started thinking that our job is to sell degrees. And that's not, I don't know that that's the job to be done, to use Bill's reference to Clayton. But we are as a community developing followers of Jesus who can help others develop followers of Jesus, right? It's discipleship. The byproduct is a degree. Great, that's awesome. But if we make that the focus, I think that's where you get student debt. You get the disconnect between the church and the academy. It's where you get some of the problems that we've seen stem or sprout up over the past 40 years. But if we could get back to high quality discipleship, is by definition going to be able to award a degree, because that's what it was. Like you talked about Ignatius, right? The academy grew out of the church. Like this is something that we do, is develop followers of Jesus. So maybe to get to the stewardship language that you were using, Bill, is how do we steward followers of Jesus who flourish in their vocations for the sake of the world? Let's think about that together. not in our own little worlds, but stewarding followers of Jesus, flourish in their vocations for the sake of the world. Let's do that together.
Very good. Awesome. Well, Franklin, you want to share your announcements with us?
The only one I have is that we started this conversation series back in September. Our first conversation was on race and reconciliation, for obvious reasons. We wanted to not be so heavy during the season of Advent, but our next conversation will be February 10th, and it's going to be entitled Purple Church, Bridging the Political Divide. And so we're going we have a few individuals, Mark Beckwith, who is a retired bishop in the Episcopal Church. He doesn't know it yet because I haven't asked him, but and a few other individuals that are going to talk about how we can bridge this pretty large political divide within our churches. So that's what's upcoming in February, and that's the only announcement I had. Jessica.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you guys so much again for your time and the blessing of that. We very much appreciate it, and all of your wonderful thoughts. And as I said, we will get this posted as well so that others get to benefit from that as well. But thank you again, and we will look for ways to partner. I'm excited about that. I'm excited to partner with you and to be a part and to see what the future holds. This is not what I thought I was getting into at 16 when I was called. It's just not. It's a very different landscape than it was 20 years ago. So I'm excited about what God's doing and looking forward to the rest of the journey. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Keep doing it, and let's work together on that. Thank you, folks. Anything else?
Thank you.
All right. Have a wonderful night, friends. Bye.